There's a specific kind of person who burns out differently from everyone else. Not loudly, not with a breakdown that other people can point to and name. They don't wake up one morning and announce they can't do this anymore. They just slow down, start turning things down, stop raising their hand in meetings the way they used to, go quiet in the rooms where they used to be the most present person. And the people around them often don't notice right away because this person still shows up, still delivers, still says the right things until one day they don't. And by that point, the fire's been out for a long time. If you were identified early as gifted, if your childhood contained a specific kind of attention from adults who expected things from you, a specific kind of pressure that looked from the outside like opportunity, you probably know exactly what that person looks like, either because you are them or because you were them and you haven't been able to name what happened. Here is what nobody says clearly enough. The burnout didn't start at 22. It started being built in the 3rd grade. Picture this. It's 2009. You are 9 years old. You've been placed in an advanced program or pulled aside by a teacher who told your parents you were special in a way that needed attention, or simply told, directly and repeatedly, that you were smarter than other kids. The family gatherings had a particular script. The adults asked you questions they didn't ask the other children and waited with a kind of anticipatory pleasure for your answers. Your academic performance wasn't just something you did. It was what you were. The identity was built into the grammar of how the adults around you spoke about you, long before you had any framework to evaluate it. And here is what that experience produces inside a 9-year-old that almost no one names at the time. It doesn't just teach you that you're smart. It teaches you that being smart is what you are for, that your value in the room, your belonging in the room, is contingent on producing something that justifies the expectation. The approval arrives immediately every time you get it right. The withdrawal of it, when you don't, is just as immediate. And a brain in development, learning the rules of its environment, learns this rule fast. Psychologists who study achievement and identity development call this a contingent self-worth structure, a psychological architecture in which a person's sense of value is not unconditional but tied to performance. Carol Dweck's decades of research at Stanford documented what this produces over time. When children are recognized specifically for their intelligence, praised for being smart rather than for the process of thinking, they develop an orientation in which intellectual performance is not something they do, but something they are. Her research found that children with this orientation are more likely to avoid challenges where failure is possible, more likely to interpret difficulty as evidence of something being fundamentally wrong with them, and more likely to report persistent anxiety in high-stakes settings. Not because they lack ability, because their sense of self is structurally tied to the outcome. Every test isn't just a test. It's a referendum on whether they deserve to take up space. That structure gets built early. By adolescence, it's load-bearing. And then, exactly when it was most load-bearing, the algorithm found it. What Jonathan Haidt's research on the collapse of adolescent mental health documented was a generational pattern, the great rewiring of childhood that tracked almost precisely with smartphone adoption between 2010 and 2015, producing what he described as the sharpest decline in youth mental health indicators ever recorded in survey data. But inside that generational pattern, gifted Gen Z kids experience something more specific. Social media environments run on performance metrics, immediate, quantified, public feedback on whatever version of yourself you present. It is structurally the most natural habitat that has ever existed for a brain already trained to equate visibility with approval. A gifted teenager who had spent years building an identity around producing things that earned adult validation walked onto platforms specifically engineered to deliver that validation at scale. Likes, shares, follower counts, algorithmic amplification of the version of yourself that performs best. For most adolescents, social media was a difficult adjustment. For gifted Gen Z kids, it was a precision amplifier pointed directly at the most structurally fragile part of their psychology. Research on adolescent identity development describes what happens when an environment delivers constant external feedback before any internal stability exists to filter it. Identity foreclosure. the premature locking in of a self-concept before the natural process of exploration is complete. For most adolescents, this is a risk. For the gifted kid, it arrived with a specific intensity. They weren't simply optimizing a casual social presentation. They were optimizing the only self they had learned to be, the achiever, the one who delivers, the one whose job it is to justify the attention invested in them. And every time that self performed and was rewarded, the walls around it got a little thicker. By 17, that optimization was running constantly. The academic performance, the extracurriculars, the college application, the curated presence across multiple platforms. All of it was a single, continuous system. And the system worked, which is precisely why what happened next was so disorienting. There's a reason this specific pattern is hard to talk about clearly, even for the people living it. The popular image of burnout involves someone visibly overworked, someone who can point to the pile that crushed them. The gifted kid's burnout rarely looks like that from the outside, and often doesn't feel like that from the inside either. What researchers studying high-achieving populations describe is something subtler. Not the exhaustion of having done too much, but the gradual disappearance of the internal signal that made doing things feel like it mattered. The work might still be getting done. The deliverables still delivered. But the thing underneath, the thing that used to make achievement feel like proof of something, goes quiet. And when it does, the performance continues for a while on momentum, because the gifted kid is skilled at performing. But it continues empty. That specific emptiness, continuing to produce without knowing why anymore, is what researchers distinguish from ordinary overwork, and it is harder to name because from the outside, the person still looks functional. Here's what the developmental research describes as the critical shift that happens between 18 and 22. Jeffrey Arnett's work established emerging adulthood as a distinct developmental stage characterized by one feature that distinguishes it from everything that came before. For the first time in most people's lives, the external structure that has been organizing their identity and daily rhythm simply stops. No school year, no grading cycle, no institution measuring worth on a predictable schedule and reporting the results back. For most young adults, this transition is difficult but navigable. They have enough internalized sense of self to function without the scaffolding. What the research on high-achieving adolescents consistently shows is that this transition is disproportionately destabilizing for those whose identity was built almost entirely on that scaffolding. When it falls away, there is nothing underneath that knows what to want without it. When the gifted Gen Z kid arrives at 22 without a grade to earn, without a teacher to impress, without a set of standardized metrics against which they can demonstrate value on a reliable schedule, they don't feel free. They feel like a system running without input, not invisible to others, invisible to themselves. Research on perfectionism and achievement identity in young adults describes a pattern that appears repeatedly in this literature. High-achieving individuals who built their self-concept around performance are significantly more likely to experience a collapse in motivation and sense of purpose following major achievement milestones, particularly when a next external benchmark is absent or unclear. This is not clinical depression, though depression is frequently present. It is more precisely what happens when a navigation system loses signal. The engine is running. The capacity is real, but the destination, and with it, the sense of forward motion, is gone. But here's what sits underneath even that, and it's the part that almost never gets named directly. The gifted kid spent years learning to read what the room needed and produce it. They became expert at what psychologists call external self-monitoring, the continuous calibration of behavior and presentation to match the signals of the surrounding environment. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that high self-monitors, people who consistently prioritize external cues over internal ones when determining how to present themselves, report significantly higher rates of emotional exhaustion than those whose behavior is anchored primarily in internal values. Not because their lives are more demanding, because the sustained work of performing a self that is always tuned to the audience is its own ongoing labor, running beneath everything else like a background process that never fully terminates. For a gifted Gen Z kid who had been running that process since early childhood, the accumulated cost by 22 was not measured in hours worked. It was measured in years of continuous performance maintenance with no genuine off switch. The exhaustion wasn't a reaction to the last thing they did. It was the bill for the previous 15 years of not knowing that performing a self costs more than being one. What makes this specific to this generation, and not just to gifted kids across every era, is the overlap. The allostatic load of growing up inside an architecture engineered to maintain the nervous system in continuous activation. The identity formation conducted under public metrics before any internal stability existed to evaluate them. The COVID disruption arriving precisely when the social scaffolding of early adulthood was supposed to be constructed. A 2021 study published in JAMA Network Open found that young adults between 19 and 24 showed the highest rates of depression and anxiety during pandemic lockdowns compared to every other demographic studied. For gifted Gen Z kids, that impact landed on top of an identity structure already running at maximum external monitoring capacity, with no internal reserve built up to absorb it. That is not weakness. That is an accurate description of accumulated load. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If you recognize yourself in the third grade classroom where approval arrived in real time and its withdrawal was just as fast, if you recognize yourself in the optimization, in the continuous performance, in the quiet that came not dramatically but as a slow subtraction, hear this clearly. The capacity the gifted label built in you is real. The intelligence, the discipline, the ability to produce under pressure, those are yours. What happened is that they were developed entirely in the service of an audience, and you arrive at a point where the audience structure changed and nothing underneath had been developed to function without it. The question the burnout is actually asking isn't whether you can still perform. You can. The question is whether performing is still the right definition of why. Most gifted kids were never taught to hold that question because the system that identified them never needed them to. The system needed output. Output was rewarded. The questions that didn't produce measurable output. Who am I when I stop delivering? What do I actually want? What would I explore if no one were grading it? Those questions had no scheduled time, no grade attached, no adult waiting for the answer. So they stayed unasked. And the person who arrives at 22 burned out isn't arriving broken. They're arriving at the first major question their identity was never equipped to answer. The research on recovery in this specific population is consistent about one thing. The path forward is not new achievement. It is, repeatedly, the sustained practice of environments where performance is not the currency of admission, where you are allowed to be genuinely uncertain and unimpressive without that meaning anything about your worth, where the version of you that shows up isn't calibrated to a perceived expectation. Developmental psychologists call this exploratory identity development, the process that was bypassed or compressed during the years the gifted kid was busy proving themselves. It doesn't produce visible output in the short term. It produces something more durable, a self-concept that doesn't require external confirmation to hold its shape. The burnout at 22 is not evidence that you used up what you had. It is precisely the first signal that the framework you had been using to define yourself never contained all of you to begin with. That is not a verdict. It is an opening. If this gave language to something you've been carrying without being able to name it, say it in the comments. Not for me, but because naming it accurately is usually the first thing that starts to shift the relationship with it. And if you know someone this video is about, someone who is the gifted kid and has gone quiet in ways they can't explain, send it without explanation. Sometimes that's the whole conversation. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.